Welcome, everybody. My microphone decided not to work right before, so we're weathering uncertainty here at the Lead Center. Welcome to all of you in person, as well as all of you joining online. We're very happy to have you here. Tonight's program is presented by Humanities Nebraska with help from several important partners. I hope you noticed on the screen or in the printed program that each of you picked up the names of the people and organizations who helped make tonight possible. This Weathering Uncertainty conversation is part of a national initiative called Democracy and the Informed Citizen. It is funded by the Mellon Foundation and administered by the Federation of State Humanities Council. You can learn more about Humanities Nebraska's work in the program or by visiting their website, humanitiesnebraska.org. I do have some opening comments, and I'm a professor at the university, so I wrote them down so I wouldn't go too long here in this opening session. Everyone talks about the weather. It's something that impacts all of us, some of us more than others. It is part of so many decisions that we make in our daily life, where we choose to live. It can result in tragedy or wonder and awe, and it can bring us all together. In the summer of 1935, Nebraska and the Great Plains was in the midst of the worst hard time, as some call it. Drought, heat, unemployment, poverty, food shortages impacted so many. My father was an infant and the youngest of 4 siblings that lived on a family farm here in Nebraska. Sadly, his parents, my grandparents, were killed when a train hit their automobile as they were headed to town to sell eggs and fresh produce. Because money and resources were low, it was the Great Depression, my dad and his siblings were each placed with different aunts and uncles, so they were not able to grow up together as they normally would have. While not a direct impact of the Dust Bowl, my dad's upbringing was indirectly tied to this keystone event in our climate history. But the Earth is faster now. The speed at which these extremes are coming at us is accelerating. The flood of 2019, the ongoing drought, flash flood events, tornadoes. In December, there was 30 tornadoes confirmed in Nebraska last December, hail, dust storms, deadly fires, and my God, the wind, the incessant wind this spring. This increasingly extreme weather is a major way that we feel our changing climate. Climate is like weather's a big brother. That's how I like to think about it. It's always trying to tell it what to do. Sometimes a little nudge, and sometimes a takedown wrestling move. There's one thing that I've learned in my 6 years as state climatologist. Nebraskans do care about climate change. We want to hear how people are dealing with change and learn from each other. We want to talk through solutions. We want to have a seat at the table and not be on the menu. So thank you for coming to our table. So I will kick things off with some questions. We'll be opening up to audience participation about halfway through. So please submit your questions via Slido. I think there's, instructions right there on the screen. So you can submit those questions. A few items to keep in mind is something that I remind my 8 and 10-year-olds. That's be kind, keep it simple, stay objective, and be patient. We have a superb lineup here this evening. Mark McHargue, he's the president of the Nebraska Farm Bureau since 2020. Farms in Central City area. He has a construction operation and a passion for agriculture policy and advocacy. We have Dr. Hannah Birge. She's the Director of Agriculture for the Nature Conservancy. Used to work here in Nebraska locally, but has advanced in position to the global Nature Conservancy. She's a UNL graduate, like myself. She has a background in soils and water and agriculture and grasslands and ecosystems. Also an interest in Arctic mid-latitude connections. And her and I spent some time walking the streets of St. Petersburg, Russia, years ago, which seems like decades ago now. We have Dr. Jesse Bell. He is the Director of Water, Climate, and Health Program at UNMC. Hails from Northeast Nebraska and spent some time at the Centers for Disease Control. So we're really excited to have this health perspective with us here on the panel tonight. And Josh Moenning, Mayor of Norfolk since 2016, small business owner, spent some time in the Nebraska legislature, as well as in DC, and we won't hold that against you. He's also a UNL alum. So we thought we would kick it off in terms of what concerns do we have about our changing climate? And I thought there was going to be some answers on the screen here that you all would fill in terms of the audience, thinking about what concerns you most about extreme weather events and our changing climate. So extreme weather, that got 41% of you. That's a typical response that I've heard. Food security is up there, climate justice, economic well-being, and public health. So extreme weather tends to be high up on the list here. So I just kind of like to go through each of you, and if you just want to articulate, maybe it could be either personally or within the role that you serve, what concerns you most about climate change? And maybe I'll start with you, Mark.
Well, thank you, Martha. Yeah, first of all, I really want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I've been looking forward to this discussion for quite a while because I think it really is a very important topic that actually is probably more top of mind than we might think. But in agriculture, so both for myself as a fourth generation farmer, my son's a fifth generation farmer, and then representing agriculture across Nebraska and United States as I sit on a national board, the thing that concerns me most within my operation and with those that I represent is as we have the conversations about climate change, we in agriculture deal with it every day. I mean, we wake up thinking about the weather, we go to bed thinking about the weather, and we've actually had to adjust to climate changes, both warm and cold, since we've been farming. And so it's almost a daily occurrence that we have to, or certainly seasonal, that we have to make adjustments. But the thing that concerns me is how we develop policy around this topic. And so I think it's pretty easy for those that maybe aren't in the business of producing food every day to have some really strong opinions, but when it comes to actually having to change practices on our farm, to adjust, and we want to make sure that that is voluntary based and incentive based as we move forward. And farmers are very willing to make those adjustments. We've been adapting and mitigating for really a long time. But I was out in the field the last several days trying to keep track of weeds, the wind, and then the hail and rain, and it's a real deal. It's a real topic that we need to have a conversation about.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, Hannah.
Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to be with you all here tonight. I actually have a somewhat similar answer for both people and ecosystems. When I think about climate change, I think about it as a threat multiplier and a capacity reducer. So if I think about an ecosystem that's already probably suffering from something like nitrogen deposition that's altering the flow of resources through that system, biodiversity loss, fragmentation, climate change is amplifying all of those threats. And so it's not something we can look at separately from those drivers. It's something that really is sort of part and parcel of them. And I think about a farmer. I work with a lot of farmers, and I think that it's almost something similar. Farmers need options, they need capacity, they need the resources to be able to adjust and improve when extreme weather strikes. And climate change narrows those options because they have less capacity to operate. And so it's really similar in my mind when I think about human systems, when I think about natural systems, I think about making sure we have fate control, the capacity to adjust, to adapt, and to have options. And what worries me about climate change is those options are being narrowed.
Yes, yeah. Kind of brings up the idea of planning for different scenarios. And so how does your scenario defined? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jesse?
I think that's a great question. You know, when looking at it from my lens, and I'm one of the lenses up there with the public health side, I'm definitely concerned about the societal issues that are associated with climate change. You know, as you're very well aware of, we are in a changed climate. The climate that we live in today is different than the climate that we would have lived in 50 years ago. And our climate is continuing to change over the next 50, 100 plus years. And those changes are having impacts on us today, and they're going to continue to have impacts on us in the future. And one of those impacts is human health. And that's a major concern, because I think a lot of times when we've talked about climate change in the past, we've framed it in that context of an environmental issue. And it is an environmental issue, but it's a societal issue. And those societal impacts do relate back to our health in some capacity. And that's where I'm concerned, and that's some of the work that I focus on, is trying to address some of those issues. Understand where our at-risk populations are, understand what are our vulnerabilities, and then making sure that we put things in place to reduce those risks and vulnerabilities so that we can save lives as we move forward. And we see that. Extreme weather was the first one that came up. And with extreme weather events, that is the most easy way to see the impacts on us. And we've seen the changes in extreme weather events. We have more frequent and intense extreme weather events now than we would have had in the past. And we're seeing those changes continue over time. And each time you have one of those extreme weather events, if it hits your community, there is a possibility for a potential human health outcome. And there are impacts on our society, whether it's the most severe, which is death, mortality, but there's also all these indirect and delayed health impacts that are associated with this. And we need to better understand that. We need to make sure that our communities understand that as well, so we can reduce those health impacts in the future.
Yeah. So that's a good segue. So you mentioned communities, and we've got the mayor of kind of a regional hub in Northeast Nebraska.
Sure.
So
I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Yeah. I said beforehand we should have brought ferns up on stage. This seems like a good between two firms climate change edition. Yes, I would say what concerns me most is preparedness and adaptation. Preparedness for extreme weather events. I look back over the last 10 years, and we've experienced in that time, in my area, 2 100-year floods, historic drought, a couple polar vortexes thrown in there. So we're living in the reality of this uncertainty, and that puts a lot of stresses on local governments. Norfolk is in the position of having had to learn the hard way, having settled on the banks of the North Fork of the Elkhorn River. We faced flooding from the community's founding in the 1860s. It took 100 years for the community to come together to say, okay, we need to invest in a flood control diversion channel that saves our community millions and millions of dollars and lost lives, and it has over recent decades. But with the frequency of these events now, that reinvestment and that investment for communities that are not prepared for the impacts of these extreme weather events will increasingly become important to discuss and then come to solutions on. And then adaptation, how do we become part of the solution? I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. In my view, there are opportunities in Nebraska through clean energy development, reducing our carbon, and with that, undertaking activities that contribute to the new economy.
Yeah. So I'm just curious. So extreme weather, it ranks up really high here. And when you talk about climate change in your area, do you find that extreme weather is a good segue? Is that a good way to reach people in terms of their understanding and talking about climate change?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is about communicating it the right way, right? Talking about the realities of what we live in today. And people intuitively sense that. We've seen increased frequency of these extreme events, and we just have to adapt. It's not about politics, it's about adaptation.
Right, yeah. And maybe I'd ask that same question to Mark. Is that something that you sit around the table or the coffee shop? Is extreme weather, does that rank pretty high for you, or?
It's interesting. I saw a study just this week that segment of consumers were polled and asked about climate change and how high that was on their worry list, and about 75% actually said that they're worried or very worried about climate change. But it was interesting that when you drilled into that, the Midwest had actually a little bit lower score on their worry. And I think that's interesting, and I think that would probably hold true, and probably certainly within the sector that I work with, to a degree, because again, we deal with it every day. and we're watching it. But I think that what the bigger conversation that we're starting to have is, how do we become the solution? How can we be a part of the solution? And certainly within agriculture, when you start talking about carbon and how we sequester carbon and how that can be part of the solution, there's really some pretty incredible stories that how ag can really be a significant player in this conversation. As we grow crops, we sequester carbon, we are part of the biofuels and ethanol and green energy. I think you put that all together, and I think the Midwest, even though maybe slightly less concerned, can be one of the big drivers in tackling this conversation.
Yeah, so some of you have mentioned vulnerabilities. I know you did, Jesse. Kind of from your perspective and what you've worked on, what do you see as some of the greatest vulnerabilities that we face in Nebraska? So I'm kind of starting with the concerns and the problems and then kind of transitioning later to what are these solutions. But in terms of vulnerabilities, where do you think we...
Yeah, that's a great point. And, you know, there's multiple different aspects there. You know, we're all vulnerable to the health impacts associated with climate change. We're all vulnerable to climate change just in general. But certain populations, certain areas are more at risk than others. And, you know, from a grander standpoint, you know, when we talk about vulnerable or at-risk communities, we're typically talking about low-income communities, we're talking about children, elderly, communities of people of color. And that's a lot of times the big focus area, and there's obviously a number of reasons for that. And we've seen that for, you know, with the pandemic, that sometimes those are the populations that are most impacted by some of these types of events. But there's another community that I think gets left out of that conversation a lot, and that's rural communities. And there's a variety of different reasons for that. You know, when I'm looking at it from a health perspective, you know, rural communities, you know, the access to care is a big issue. And so getting to a hospital and getting to a clinic or whatever is a lot more difficult in rural Nebraska than it is if you live in Omaha. And if you have something like the 2019 floods that happened, where you saw major destruction throughout the state, you saw a loss of infrastructure, you saw roads being out for a long period of time. What took me, what was usually about a 3-hour drive to get up to my parents in Bloomfield, all of a sudden became like a 5-hour drive. And when we're talking about health impacts, that matters between being able to get there quickly or getting there slowly. And you can talk about it from the concept of getting to dialysis centers and other issues that people potentially have. And so I think that's one of the big issues is, you know, we need to make sure that we frame that and have people understand that rural communities are affected by this in a variety of different ways. And so that's one of those levels of vulnerability. But, you know, we face those issues all across the state, whether it's, you know, the rural communities that potentially get impacted. You know, one of the stories I always tell is when that 2019 flooding happened, and it was in March of 2019, I remember the floods were taking place and communities were responding, and we were doing things at UNMC to help with communities and also help with messaging. But then all of a sudden, about a week later, maybe not quite a week, but close to a week or so later, some of my colleagues from around the country started contacting me, and they're like, I heard about this flooding. I hope you're okay. And I was like, well, if I wasn't, that would have been a week ago. Like, we're already in the middle of this. And I think that's one of the issues that we have here in the central part of the United States. Sometimes we're overlooked when it comes to some of these impacts. That was the costliest inland flooding event in U.S. history. And it was just kind of more of a blip on the national radar as far as what it actually meant to this state. And we see those types of events one after another, you know, whether it's extreme heat events, we're in the middle of one, you know, flooding, drought, which we have out in the western part of Nebraska. All of these things have direct impacts on us regularly, but sometimes we don't always get the attention that some of the coastal areas get. And I think that's one of the issues as well. And we have a number of different issues across the state. You know, we have one of the highest asthma-related mortality rates in the United States. And so, that's for one example, and we know that things like the growing season for ragweed pollen is increasing, which can potentially exacerbate asthma-related issues. And these are just like, there's a number of different health issues. I'm sure we can talk about it more as we move forward. I could sit up here and talk for quite a while about this, and I won't capitalize. But yeah, we have a number of vulnerabilities, number of at-risk issues within the state, and we need to make sure that we're trying to understand those so that we can help prepare and better our communities for the future as well.
Yeah. So I'm thinking back to the comment that you made earlier about climate change being a threat and multiplier, and I'm just curious, like from the Nature Conservancy perspective, are there vulnerability assessments that are done with the group, or how is vulnerability measured or tracked?
One thing that we've been working on is called our Resilient and Connected Landscapes. And when you look at an ecosystem and you look at the species there, they have certain envelopes of climate that they like to live in, where they're going to thrive. And as it gets a little bit too hot for them, some of their options are to go north, to migrate north, or to go up a mountainside in Nebraska. You probably have to go north. You don't have a lot of options. And when you see that sort of northward shift, at times they bump up against barriers, and that could be a physical barrier like a road, it could be a river, depending on what type of species you are. And so we really try to look at where in the United States we need to actually build better ecological connectivity. And one great example is the sandhills in Nebraska. If you look at a United States map of where we really need to focus our efforts on building that connectivity, the sandhills lights up. And the beautiful thing is the sandhills is, for the most part, an intact grassland. It is facing threats. We have things like eastern red cedar, which is a native tree, but it's highly invasive if there's not enough fire on the landscapes. We're seeing more eastern red cedar sort of create those barriers and really start to, curtail the ability of those species to migrate. We also have things like increasing roads and development. You see some, on the eastern and the flanks of the sandhills, you'll sometimes see sort of lands flipping back and forth between cropland and grassland. And that can create sort of barriers that are there one year and not the next. So a lot of our work really is focused on how do we work with landowners in the sandhills to manage their lands both for agricultural production, but also that ecological connectivity, because the good news is, in a lot of cases, those are one and the same. So that's really sort of a national scale perspective, but then also how it's really touching down in Nebraska and how we're working as the Nature Conservancy with landowners.
Yeah, interesting. So mentioning the sandhills and the influx of red cedar, and I think about afforestation of the landscape, and so thinking 30 years into the future, what does the sandhills of Nebraska look like? It's going to be hotter. It's going to be, our precipitation is going to shift toward wetter in the winter and drier in the summer, and there'll be more evaporation. And I don't know if you could speak to that, or just kind of from your perspective of what does that ecosystem look like?
So grasslands, to persist as grasslands, need fire and grazing and grassland management to keep grass. And eastern red cedars will slowly start coming in, and when they're about knee high and you burn that grassland full of little cedars, it's not very scary. I've been there. Like, you could outwalk it, even if you were a very slow walker. But at some threshold, those cedars get big enough and densely packed enough that if there is a fire, it is dangerous. It can get out of control really quickly. In 2012, during our droughts, our Sandhills flagship preserve, called the Niobrara Valley Preserve, a significant portion of it burned because of that. And it was a true blue emergency wildfire. And lots of buildings were lost, lots of property was damaged. And so we're seeing sort of this strange shift from grassland fires that are manageable, that maintain the ecosystem, that maintain the grass for ranchers to produce more cattle, shifting towards these systems that don't really provide those ecosystem services and present a pretty significant fire risk. And with climate change, we're expecting to see more years like 2012. And so the combination of sort of those larger growth cedar forests that we're seeing infilling the grasslands with increasingly hot and intense summer events really could start making Nebraska feel a little bit more like the West when it comes to wildfire threat, which also, in addition to sort of the ecological damage that can be incurred, has significant health impacts as well. And I guess the last sort of happy note of this anecdote is that when you have cedars that are sort of that knee high or shorter and you burn, it does go back to grass. When we have those mature, dense, closed canopy cedar forests, You burn them, and what you have left are cedar skeletons, and it's not clear that we're actually going to be able to reverse to grasslands. And so that's another reason why we actually have a team at the Nature Conservancy that goes from private land to private land, and actually provides the service of controlled burns to manage those cedars. So we are working, and that program is growing. It's really exciting to see. We've seen actually a pretty significant culture shift in the sandhills from burning is maybe something I do on my own land. I'm not quite sure. I'm a little skeptical of it. Maybe I'll manage my cedars elsewhere, to this is about collective action. We need to link arms, and we're going to team up with rural fire departments, other landowners, and the Nature Conservancy to get that done.
Yeah. So I wanted to go back to the municipal perspective, and just in terms of vulnerabilities, is that something that is assessed systematically, or I know you've got some background in clean energy, and so is that kind of a way that you're tackling that?
I'll take it from more of a general policy perspective. I think being slow to act and to react is a vulnerability in itself. I think at the state level, we're among a minority of states that does not have a climate action plan. And that's not an end-all in itself, right? But it is an important policy framework to start a discussion and start the process of engaging state officials with local government leaders in the conversation about how do we better plan for this uncertainty when it comes to our weather events. And I think we kind of get in a habit here because we're not part of a coastal area, because there's not necessarily the media attention you were talking to on some of these bigger weather events, to say, well, it's not something we need to deal with immediately here. But I think it is, and I think it needs to be elevated in terms of its importance among policymakers, both at the state and local levels. And that's not to say there's a vacuum in that discussion right now. Cities are required to have certain plans in place for emergency preparedness, but it doesn't really reach into this discussion of the higher frequency of extreme weather events that we're seeing right now. And so I think a little more proactive engagement in the planning process would be helpful both at the state and local levels.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Nebraska does not have a climate action plan. So you bring up a good point of kind of local governance, how much comes from the top down and how much comes from the bottom up, but just in terms of either adaptation or mitigation, and kind of from a city perspective, do you feel that the most successful and longest lasting efforts would be that bottom up?
I think from the local level, yes. But I think it has to be a partnership, and I think there has to be an avenue of support created, because we're talking about, cities of a certain size are going to be able to accommodate and be a little bit more flexible in reaction to some of these things than smaller towns and certainly villages. And so there does need to be an attitude of we're in this together, and we need to have the discussion together on how we help bring about the resources that we're going to need to be prepared.
Yeah, good point. So I'm curious, kind of from an agriculture perspective and from a longtime operator, and kind of that thinking about what is at the federal level versus what is done at the on-farm level, and incentivizing action, toward mitigation and adaptation. What's kind of your feel, and how much would you like to see a top-down versus kind of producer-led and transition to different practices, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's really important that, again, as I said, the actions are voluntary and incentive-based, because I think in general, if you're trying to get people to do things, I think there has to be some sort of compensation to get people to try new things, to try to get them maybe out of their comfort zone. And in Nebraska, where we're pretty unique in that 97% of our ground is privately owned, and majority of it is actually ag-based. So if you take off from here and drive to Colorado, or from Kansas to South Dakota, you can really, aside from a couple of minutes if you look out to the right and to the left, you'll see agriculture. And so when we're talking about such a significant sector and part of our land base, it becomes really important that when we do deal with policies, that we're making them from a scientific base, from solid information, and then that it's voluntary incentive based. And so I think one area that I have experience in is that I think there's a sentiment out there that from a climate standpoint, going to a more organic system of farming would actually be more beneficial to the climate. Now, I've been organic farming on about half of our acres for 7 or 8 years, and my experience has been that it has a much higher carbon footprint. It mainly is because it takes almost 4 times the amount of fuel, because now we are mechanically tilling the ground. You have to till the ground to keep the weeds. One of the things that when we start talking about carbon sequestration is that you actually reduce tillage. Well, in organic, you actually go the opposite direction. And so when you have people making policy that maybe don't really understand modern farming practices, and that we have actually cut our emissions dramatically per pound of greenhouse gases. I'm in pork production. Since early 1990s, we've increased pork production almost 77%, the amount of pork that we produce, while at the same time reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by almost 23%. So we've grown dramatically production. We've reduced dramatically our greenhouse gas emissions. It's the same in our corn and our soybeans and in our beef, that we're doing a great job of actually producing. I think one of our vulnerabilities is food insecurity. We're actually providing the world with food, at the same time dramatically reducing our environmental footprint. And I think that's the kind of message that policymakers have to understand as they're actually making policy that kind of trickles down to the farm gate.
Yeah, so I want to get back to kind of these health risks. So Jesse, what are some specific steps that we could take to make sure we have positive health outcomes and reduce our risk?
A lot of things. And one, going back to it, climate action plan, and having leadership saying that this is an issue and that strategically we can tackle this issue from multiple different sectors and multiple different perspectives. And, there is the mitigation piece that everybody talks about, like reducing carbon emissions for the future, and I 100% agree with that. But there's also that adaptation piece, and because we're in a changed climate, we need to make sure that we're doing things that are actually having benefit to improving the lives and improving the livelihood of the individuals that are in the middle of this changed climate. Because if we're not addressing those issues now, and as they continue to get worse in the future, those impacts are only going to be more apparent. And they're already fairly apparent right now. And so one of the ways that we can do this is making sure that our public health officials throughout the state are engaged in the conversation, and making sure that public health and healthcare is at the table when we're talking about climate change, because they have a vested stake in this. I mean, you look at what UNMC Nebraska Medicine is doing. We've been working on education for our healthcare professionals and also for our public health professionals that are graduating from our school, to make sure that they understand that climate change is an issue, because climate change is one of the great challenges when it comes to human health moving forward. And then, and so making sure we have them engaged in the conversation, making sure that we have climate action plans and we have opportunities to look for improving our communities around us. There's a lot of communities out there that have done a lot of investment in things like extreme heat. Extreme heat likely kills more people in the United States than any other climate or weather-related event. And that's because we have extreme heat events here. We probably have multiple that we're going to have. There are extreme heat events all across the United States. And so some communities are already actively engaging around this. And they're trying to understand, and they're having plans put in place to try to reduce health impacts. And so making sure that like outdoor workers are getting water and taking breaks at the appropriate time. Looking at the populations that are most at risk in their cities and in their communities, and making sure resources are available for them. For example, cooling centers, and this is where people can go to get away from the heat, especially if you don't have air conditioning or if you're a low income individual. That's a resource that's available. But if those cooling centers aren't in the right place, that's just not a good fit, right? And there's a potential for a human health impact, and there's a way of reducing that. And then there's other things, they make sure that there's shade over bus stops for people that are using public transportation. Little things like that can have a huge impact. But we need to make sure that we're seeing this from a broader perspective and from an institutional perspective, because once government officials and once other individuals are taking this seriously, then we can look at all these potential risk factors for all of our different populations that we have in our state, and making sure that we're protecting those populations now and doing the things that we can to mitigate and reduce health impacts. Whether it's the flooding, drought, or heat waves, each one of those has impacts on our health. And there are things that we can do to reduce those health impacts. So if we can start doing that now, we're setting ourselves up for fewer impacts in the future, or reducing the impacts in the future.
Yeah. So you listed off some specific things that we can do, and there are with climate change and increasing our resilience to extreme events. There's so many different solutions. There's not just one solution. There's many, many different solutions in many different sectors, and which almost complicates it. Then it's everybody's problem and nobody's problem. So I wanted to touch a little bit on how you all engage with people on the topic of climate change. So it's something that I do pretty much daily, and so I'm just curious to kind of hear perspectives on just communication strategies, and what do you find works best and what doesn't, and kind of what approach you use to talk about something that can be not easy to talk about, and people have varying views. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. Maybe we'll start with you, Josh.
Sure. I think talking about this in terms of it's a challenge, right? But it also comes with opportunity. So if we embrace the position of being part of the climate solution leading to economic opportunities, especially in our rural places, I think that is a very effective way to have this discussion. We're seeing that play itself out in real life in Northeast Nebraska. It's been the hotbed of clean energy development over the last 5 to 10 years in the state. A lot of wind energy development has come into place throughout that region, and that has meant new jobs, both in the construction phase and then the operations phase. It's meant new farm income for property owners leasing that space for wind, and now solar coming on as well. And it's been new tax revenues for counties and local governments that I think can be a solution to alleviating the property tax burden that we have in the state. And so when you can talk about the opportunities that come with the challenge and tie it back to business activity that is contributing to us being part of the solution, but also generating new business enterprise in our local economies, that's real to people. And you've seen through our institutions in and around Norfolk, we've supported that. Northeast Community College has the only accredited wind energy program in the state, and it's training young people who 10 years ago had to move to Iowa or Minnesota to find jobs. They can stay here now in their small towns in Northeast Nebraska because the opportunity is there. And that's having a big impact on our economy. In Norfolk, I think our local economy was pretty well insulated from some of the worst of the last few years, the pandemic, because a lot of that construction phase spending continued. From 3 to 4 years ago to today, we've had anywhere from 800 to 1,000 wind farm construction workers in our local economy spending money there and bringing on those projects that are creating those new jobs and generating new tax revenue and new farm income opportunities for farmers.
Yeah, I think keeping it local and solutions focused is always a good way to go. That's something that I've noticed is people really want to work through solutions and flipping it into, it's a huge grand challenge, but it's also a very good opportunity and to pivot into something that maybe you hadn't thought about before. So, Hannah, I don't know if you want to comment on that as well, just engagement with people on this topic.
Sure. So one of the things that I love about working for the Nature Conservancy is we engage on multiple scales. So with our members of Congress or our state policymakers, we understand what's important to that policymaker and we bring them the science that they need to make informed, information-based votes and decisions because they are representing us and they should be working in our best interests. And oftentimes that means the best available science on climate change. But in my role, I actually work more directly at the closer to the ground scale with farmers. And I actually reached out to a few farmers that I work with in advance of tonight because I wanted to hear their thoughts on climate change. When we work with farmers at the Nature Conservancy, one thing we're doing is we're piloting payments to farmers to take on practices that sequester carbon in the soil. And we're finding really fast uptake, and we are finding that when those practices are on the ground, we are storing more carbon in our cropland in Nebraska. And I've been asked the question before, so these farmers believe in climate change? And some do, and some don't. And I think it's really important that to acknowledge that in science generally, skepticism is embraced, it's welcomed. I have a PhD in soil science. I would not have it if I didn't learn how to have a skeptical mind and a really critical mind. And when it comes to climate change, I think there's been this strange departure where we say, if you express skepticism in climate change, you've failed a value test, and I can't work with you, and maybe you're not a good person, and maybe you don't like science. And that's a cartoonish, characterization. I know not everyone feels that way, but a lot of farmers do. And they feel like if they work with us, they can't express skepticism. And so we're trying really hard to embrace that and to say, if you have a scientific mind, you should embrace skepticism. We should be willing to have these conversations at that scale, and we should listen. And some of the messages that I've gotten from farmers are pretty phenomenal. So we hear things like, we saw extreme droughts in the 50s, in the 90s, in 2012. That was our climate crisis. Like, we know that extreme weather is part and parcel of being a farmer, and maybe it has gotten worse in the last 10 years, but I don't know, because it's really hard to get a signal from the noise. And I'm open to it, but I know that I go day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, and trying to piece all of those together and pinpoint that signal of climate change in the noise that is the weather of Nebraska is really hard. So a lot of the work that we do is working again with the policy level scale where we're bringing the science and we're pushing our policymakers to represent our best interests and to vote the right way on climate change. But we're also working with farmers, and we do not discount their really important traditional ecological knowledge about the land. One thing that we like to say is, we don't need to be right, we just want to be happy. And if a farmer is adopting those practices and they're engaging with us in a conversation about climate change and they're willing to express that skepticism and hear us out, that's a huge win for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Thank you. So we do have a Wordle on the screen here. So what word do you think of first when you hear the term climate change? And that can automatically just be a turnoff for some people or some audiences. But so this is what all of you think here. So this kind of goes back to the first question that we had in that severe weather extremes, heat, drought, water, those definitely rank as high. But some of these other ones that we've got here, unpredictable, uncertainty, fear is what somebody thinks of first when they hear the term climate change. So that this conjures up a lot of different things in people's minds when they think of climate change. So I think given the amount of time that we have left here, what I'm going to do is transition to those that have asked questions on Slido. And so I can leave it to really anyone to answer these questions. But so the first one here, how will climate change affect the quantity and quality of Nebraskans' water resources in the next 20 years, next 50 years? So quantity and quality in the next few decades due to climate change. We're going to be hotter. There's going to be more evaporative demand. But we rely a lot on our water resources here in Nebraska. We wouldn't be the Cornhusker state if we didn't have water. So does anybody want to tackle that?
I'll maybe start just because water is so critical to both the economy of Nebraska and what we do in agriculture really depends largely on the water. Now, we are extremely blessed. I had the opportunity to travel in the Middle East this winter, and our water issues are like pale in comparison to their issues. But the fact that we do have a significant groundwater in Nebraska, we have good surface water, and it's imperative that we protect that, because it really is our lifeblood. If you take water out of Nebraska or impair it, we really economically would not be who we are. I mean, there's just no question about that. And so I think agriculture really does understand that. Now, I think we can get into water quality, and I think, Jesse, maybe you've got some study in that, but one of the conversations I'm just going to throw out there is nitrates in our water. Mm-hmm. And as a farmer that uses nitrogen fertilizer to grow our crops, that's a really important conversation that agriculture talks about, both from the university level and our research level, and then implementing that back on our lands to ensure that we protect our water both for irrigation and our drinking water when it comes to human health. Now, I can tell you that the research has come a long ways in how we handle nitrogen on our farms. And so I live right along the Platte River Valley, and so for the last probably 20 or 30 years, we haven't put any nitrogen fertilizer on until really we plant our crop. And then we put the majority of our nitrogen fertilizer on after the crop is growing. And the reason we do that is just so that we have immediate uptake and we don't have the potential to leach. But then within our technology that we have, whether it be sensing our soil moisture to ensure that we don't irrigate when we don't need to be irrigating. The fact that on our farm, on our corn, probably when my dad started farming, we've been irrigated for a long time. He was producing about maybe 80 bushel of corn on X amount of gallons. Mm-hmm. That same amount of gallons of water, we can produce almost 220 bushel. And we haven't actually increased our water demand. And that's largely due to plant breeding genetics, the ability to tolerate water drought a little bit more, the ability to water on time, all those things that we've put together to address some of our water quality issues and water quantity.
Mm-hmm. Any of you others want to?
Yeah, I can jump in there. When the water quality quantity piece is definitely something I'm interested and concerned about for a variety of different reasons. And what some of the things that we've talked about already, droughts and floods. Anytime you have a drought or you have a flood, there is a potential for water quality issues in the state. The 2019 flooding was a perfect example of that. We saw some of the groundwater resources, the wellheads become flooded, and then you see contamination of that drinking water. And then also just water availability as well. And then there's been recent studies that have come out and showed that we have arsenic in our groundwater here in Nebraska. And there was a study that was done by the U.S. Geological Survey last year that showed during drought events, you can actually find higher concentrations of arsenic in groundwater because that water resource gets dried up and taken up, and you see more concentration. You see the same thing with surface water as well. And yeah, it makes me a little bit concerned as well because, and Martha, you're much more aware of this than I am, but when you look at Nebraska and some of the projections forward with how climate will potentially change for this region, we expect our winters to get wetter and our summers to potentially get drier. And for farming, that's not necessarily the right direction that you want to go. But also from human health and water quality and quantity issues, that's not the direction we want to go either. And so, yeah, that definitely makes me concerned. And it kind of goes back to what you were talking about. We have the solutions for a lot of these problems to make sure that we're protecting our water resources. It's just a matter, are we implementing those solutions as well to make sure that we're continue to protect our water resources. So yeah, the water quality piece and water quantity piece is definitely a big concern, especially when we're talking about human health.
And I'll add, I would second and third the emphasis on water quality. That to me is more top of mind. We absolutely have solutions, but there are parts of it that are somewhat intractable. And I say that because, farming practices have improved, and the amount of nitrogen that's put on the soil versus how much is taken up has gotten a lot more efficient. And in some places, we're actually seeing, before that efficiency started, these old legacy pulses of nitrates that are moving down below where the plant roots can take them up and are slowly making their way to our drinking water wells. And that's nitrogen that was applied 10, 20, 30 years ago in some cases. And that's a tougher nut to crack, because you could go to every farmer in the state and you could give them the practices and give them the tools and the capacity and the incentives to adopt the practices that we care about. And we're not doing that yet. We absolutely could, but you're still going to have this legacy pulse of nitrogen in your drinking water. I think it's really important, especially for rural communities, again, that might not have the resources or the attention, to probably be proactive and to find ways to make sure that they are protected. I think absolutely, we can continue working with farmers and landowners to fix that, but there is this legacy problem that we do have to address as a state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we were talking about that backstage. That has come to real life to some of our small towns. We were talking about the town of Creighton, Nebraska, that was forced, compelled to implement a reverse osmosis water system for its township because they had no other choice. The nitrate concentration problem had gotten that significant. And so that's why I think it's important that we have these coordinated state and local discussions about preparedness and solutions. And to your point, Mark, earlier about incentives, some of the best incentives come through education. The best practices are economic incentives in themselves, because farmers and producers are saving on input costs through these efficiencies and thereby mitigating some of these quality impacts. But it's real that what has already occurred. There are local government systems that are having to deal with the realities of it. And if we don't get better, and if we don't start taking this advice on best practices, we're only going to face more of that in the future.
Yeah.
I think one of the ways you can think about it is also mitigation, because we have some legacy issues. I think we have to think about actually helping fund. So we work to get some ARPA money together to help put a pool of money together to actually be able to treat that water after the fact. I think we're going to have to come up with a plan in certain hotbed areas that we're going to have to quit arguing about, what caused it and how we're going to do it, but we actually got to take steps to actually put in systems that clean that up to drinkable water.
I love that. That's incredibly important to make sure that we have clean water, especially to the populations that are most at risk. And for me, it's, when we're talking about the nitrate issue, which is a little bit off, but when we're talking about the nitrate issue, it's women that are potentially pregnant or could be getting pregnant, or households with young children, because we have some major issues in this state. We have one of the highest rates of pediatric cancer in the United States, and we have high rates of birth defects as well. Now, is all of that water or environmental related? No, but there is potentially some link there, and there's been a number of research studies that have shown those associations. And so we need to make sure that we're doing the necessary steps to protecting the communities that we're already in. We're already in this situation. Like with climate change, we're already in this situation. Mm-hmm. We need to make sure that we're doing the appropriate steps to protect the populations that are most at risk.
Yeah, it's real and it's here now, and the changes are only going to get worse. So solving these legacy issues, the goal is to get it solved, because it's only going to amplify due to climate change. So for the audience's awareness, if you hadn't noticed, you can like certain questions that are there, so you can kind of up its priority on the screen there. So let's see. One that takes top priority is related to agriculture. So it's such a strong tie here in the state. What type of agriculture products or crops should we be planning to move towards for what Nebraskans what Nebraska's climate and growing season look like in 30 years, which is a great question. For part of my job, I travel around the state and help maintain and fix weather stations, and just looking at the landscape of Nebraska, we've got the sand hills, we've got row crop agriculture, and when my kids are my age, what does the landscape of Nebraska look like, and what can it look like? And can be a tough question to think about, but just in an agricultural sense, what is viable? So I'll look directly at you.
Yeah, a great question, because I think as we talk about climate change, there's a lot of conversations about the growing season moving north. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And I think going back to Josh, what you talked about, looking at the opportunities, I think within Nebraska, because we do have this water resource that is liquid gold really for Nebraska, I think there will be opportunities to adapt different crops. I mean, we're primarily corn, soybeans, because that's what works well. We can grow whatever probably the market demands or wants. I think part of that is we have to have processors come in to be able to process different crops. And so that's really, you got agriculture, we're pretty good at farming, but when you talk about bringing a processor in, a lot of times you're talking about a different type of partner. And so I think we have to be open-minded enough to think that if we do need to adjust some of our crops, certainly willing to do that, but collectively as a state, we have to have that conversation. What might that be? And then what are all those different steps that have to be involved ultimately to make that successful? But I think there are some really significant things that we can do. And again, kind of relative to the opening, farmers have been adapting and growing different crops seasonally all across the country for a long time. So the fact that we can't figure out how to grow something different is not true. I mean, we can, but I think it's going to be what the weather dictates, and then who's early adopters, who wants to take that risk. But I absolutely think that Nebraska could still continue to be a really significant player in food production for the country.
Yeah, and I'll just add, the 2012 drought, you saw declines in the Ogallala aquifer throughout, but you actually saw quite a bit of resilience in the Nebraska portion of the aquifer. What I mean by that is it rained and the aquifer sort of crept back up, whereas we saw a lot more sustained declines in the southern part of the aquifer. There's actually a choke point in sort of northwest Kansas, southwest Nebraska, and it's shallow and it's narrow, and so the declines that are happening there don't really affect us here. And so for that reason, I agree, and I think that we might actually see Nebraska becoming a pretty important powerhouse in agricultural production in the world when you see the U.S. experience droughts or other places experience droughts, because the Ogallala, it's not an unending supply, but it's quite resilient in the state. It allows us to maintain production despite drought. And so when I also think about more growing degree days in the summer, hotter temperatures combined with that water, we could just really, we're already powerhouses, but Nebraska could really rise to the top in terms of food and crop production. Absolutely.
Yeah, to me it kind of sits in this, I kind of call it the climate crossroads. And so it's dry in the west and it's going to get drier. It's wet in the east and it's going to get wetter. And so we're right in the middle here. And so how that we could be in a prime position going forward in that middle point.
A couple of years ago, when the policy door was open just a crack to hemp production, there was a lot of interest, and I heard about it in my area of the state. Traditional farmers are looking at it as an alternative crop and another revenue source. I think, again, that's where our policy needs to match up with the market demand and producers' innovation, because I think the desire is there to look at alternatives, but we need to plan for it, and we need to be forward-looking. The processing thing, as I understand it, with hemp became one of the impediments, right? We didn't have that infrastructure here, and then I think we were a little slow on allowing for permits and things like that. So it's more or less fizzled out, as I understand it, but those are opportunities that can be real moving forward. And going back to clean energy too, there's more and more traditional farmers that are looking at some of their marginal farmland and saying, okay, maybe solar makes sense here. We have a couple examples in northeast Nebraska where we're talking, 2,400 acres, going into solar production on land that probably is questionable whether it should be farmed in the first place. Those are opportunities to generate new revenues.
Yeah, so that's kind of tied to one of the questions here, which I saw. There we go. Iowa gets 30% of its energy from wind. What needs to change for Nebraska to start using more sustainable energy? So you mentioned solar, and I've got some
It's an
experience
insightful question. Iowa has about 5 times the wind production that Nebraska does, but less land mass and more dense population. We have more resource than Iowa does, much more resource in terms of wind. And so some of that has to do with policy. Again, Iowa was one of the first states to adopt policy and incentives for wind production. And the infrastructure, having the foresight of building up the transmission infrastructure capacity, which we have challenges with in Nebraska too. But we have the opportunity now to be an energy producing state. Historically we're not an oil or coal or gas state, but we are a wind and solar state. We have wind and solar potential that's in the top 10 in both, top 5 in wind and top 10 in solar. But adapting to that, seeing that as an opportunity, not as a threat in ways, is a key to this, both at the policy level and state policy level and in our local governments too. I mean, there's some areas of the state that have slammed the door shut on the opportunity because various reasons, but a lot of it comes down to fear-mongering and politics. Taking the politics out of a lot of this stuff will help us get to solutions, as it typically does in most things.
And I would also add, so one thing the Nature Conservancy is doing is we have something called our Site It Right. And wind energy is something we are for, but only if it's sited appropriately. So what we don't want is large wind turbines and things like bat migratory corridors. We don't want huge solar farms going up over intact grasslands. So wind is absolutely a part of the solution, but it's important that we site it in places that aren't going to impact our native ecosystems as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Any others want to chime in?
I think I had the opportunity, the governor appointed me to a hydrogen hub committee the other day, and I think there's some really fascinating work going on in the hydrogen and clean fuels. And so I think when you take hydrogen, you can combine that with potential some biofuels. We can make it more efficient. We could take hydrogen, potentially power one of our power plants. And the interesting thing is that within Nebraska, because of the irrigation, it takes power to pump that water. And so as we think about climate change, it's important that we have electrical production that's environmentally friendly. And so I think there's some other avenues that we can actually explore and go down. For instance, we have a company, Monolith, in Nebraska that is going to potentially create green anhydrous ammonia, which is our fertilizer. The byproduct that is carbon, they take that out. The other product is hydrogen. And so now we have a potential system that is carbon neutral that eventually feeds into one of our biggest industries, agriculture. And again, I think it sets us up to potentially be a powerhouse because not only of our production, but how we do our production in an environmentally friendly and ultimately climate friendly system.
Yeah. So we might be on that working group together.
Yes.
Let's see. So if so many of our solutions rely on rural landowners in Nebraska, how can we engage Nebraskans' urban populations? Now almost 70% of Nebraskans in solutions. So kind of an urban versus rural. And we've got people here represented. We've got Central City and Omaha residents here with us. Anybody want to take that?
Well, I can start off. I don't know if I have the best answer for this, but, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about a little bit before when it's how do you talk to different groups and, making it local and bringing in that perspective and solutions-based. Well, I do a lot of communication with younger people around climate change. And you can see within that population, and as we know, a lot of our rural areas are aging, and a lot of our population base is now Lincoln and Omaha, and that's where a lot of our younger people are moving. So there's just making that bridge there. And so when you talk to a lot of younger people, they have this, and I saw fear and I saw despair or something, that was some of the words that came up when I was talking about climate change. And one of the things that I've really done is changing my conversation with younger people and not talking about all the doom and gloom. Sure, there's plenty of doom and gloom, but really trying to focus on there's solutions, there's opportunities, and there's action. And we can do all of these things. Like when I would talk about climate change now, I'm like, there are things that you can do as an individual. There's things that you can do within your community, and there's things that you can do in the broader spectrum as well. And if you're taking those actions, you can make a difference. And you can see those differences in places like Omaha with OPPD and how they've changed their energy use and how they're changing their energy use. And that is action. That's being involved, if you're interested in this, being a part of the solution, being a part of the conversation. And that's kind of the part, to some extent, with this, with this, you changed the question for me. For me, yeah.
I thought I was moving it up, but I actually put it on the screen. I was queuing it up.
I'll just answer whatever question I want. And so I think that's part of it, is making them feel like there's an opportunity to be engaged and be a part of the solution in some capacity, and realizing that making these changes at the local level, because we know all of the solutions to these problems. It isn't like we have to come up with a brand new solution for how to address climate change. We've got most of the answers there. We just need to enact them. And so that's why we need engaged people to be a part of the conversation, to be active in their communities, and help build that bridge. And honestly, I think most of them are there. They just don't know how to make those connections. And so hopefully we can help show them or guide them through that process as well.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating question when you think about Nebraska and so much land-based, and some of these solutions we're talking about. It has an agricultural tie, but yet we have population. And it gets back to that urban-rural difference in how they think. And I think that's one of the things that Nebraska Farm Bureau and I as president, leading the ag sector, that we're very committed to having those conversations. And I think we have been in silos too long. And we all do it. We're out doing our thing, and we understand our sector of it. But it's really important that we have these cross-pollen conversations, just like we're doing tonight, to ensure that as Nebraskans, we are actually accomplishing something. And it's not a rural urban. It's just, why would somebody in the middle of the city that's maybe dealing with heat at a bus stop understand what heat is doing to my corn? I mean, so without cross-pollination and actually education across, there's not a reason that they would understand. And I think it's incumbent on us as leaders in Nebraska to actually bring those groups together, help have a shared conversation, because quite frankly, most of the time when I get to be a part of that conversation, the values that we share are 90%.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's the 10% that we just don't understand that divides us, and that really shouldn't be in a state like Nebraska.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. Yeah.
And a lot of these aren't just urban or rural applications, right? They go across the board. Next week, Norfolk will cut the ribbon on the state's largest community solar project, 8.5 megawatt project tied to a battery energy storage system. We did that not because we're tied into some green agenda, but we do believe it's part of the solution to mitigating carbon, but it also makes business sense. By participating, by buying into it, community members and businesses will save a little bit of money each month on their household or business energy bills. So there's a business case for these things. We're also, entertaining becoming a hub and a hub and spoke model for regional recycling, because there's markets now for that make business sense. We started a public transit system, comprehensive public transit system in Norfolk, because we're finding that it brings value to people's lives. It helps households get kids to school, helps people get to work, elderly people get to medical appointments, and it's working well. These are thought of as urban things typically, right? but they're working in reality in our city, which is in the middle of a rural region, because they have real life application that makes economic sense and provides value to people's lives.
Yeah. So I'll revisit the question that I popped up here that I was at the wrong time. How should the youth and students of Nebraska be involved or engaged? And what will be their climate change impacted future here in Nebraska? So I teach a 100 level class called Climate and Crisis at the university, and over the last 10 years, I've noticed students just be more and more concerned and really advocates and really leading the way in a lot of these efforts. And so I'm just curious if you have involvement with the youth, maybe young producers or young conservationists or even younger people in the city. What's your involvement or what are some good ways in these different sectors for youth to get involved?
Well, I already answered this question to some extent, but I'll give it another shot because, I work a lot with the medical students and public health students and different students at UNMC. And when I first showed up to UNMC, everybody pretty much just said, I was like, are there any student organizations dealing with the environment or sustainability? I'm just kind of curious. And people told me, they're like, no, medical students are too busy. Public health students are here for 2 years. Like, nobody really cares. And I was like, okay. And within a year, 3 medical students reached out to me and said that they wanted to create it's called the Healthy Earth Alliance, and it was around, HEAL is the short, and focused on climate change and sustainability, and especially in the context of healthcare and public health. And from there, it blossomed from 3 students and turned into a student organization to now I believe we have over 80 or 100 students that's all across UNMC. And they have been engaged. Like, you just point them in a direction and they're actually, sometimes you have to point them in a direction. They just go. And so now, because of the work that they're doing, we're having climate change integrated into the medical school curriculum so that the future doctors can understand this issue more. We have a EMIT, which is an enhanced or early medical education track, enhanced medical education track. It's like a minor for medical students. This is the only place in the U.S. that I know of that has something like this. And this is driven by the students. They're engaged, they're interested. And, I think just letting them foster that creativity and that interest and making sure that they can channel that and show that there is an actual difference that they can make. Because they're making a difference. Like, that university, from those 3 medical students now to the 80 to 100 or whatever it is, that's a part of HEAL, like, they've made a difference. They've changed the university and the practices within the university. And I think that kind of, to me, shows like you can make a difference. And it might be at a smaller scale, but you can make a difference in a lot of different ways that can have impacts for generations to come.
Yeah, that's a great story.
Yeah, and I work a lot with big private companies in the food and beverage companies. And this is a message probably more for the MBA type students or students interested in going into business administration. Large Fortune 500 and even 1,000 companies right now are embedding sustainability and climate change solutions in their business model. It is no longer possible to be a large publicly traded company without trying to tackle this somehow. And in fact, the Security and Exchange Commission has actually just released a proposal investigating whether or not they should require climate-related disclosures from publicly traded companies. So even if that doesn't go through, and we hope it does at the Nature Conservancy, if you are a student who might think that climate change is outside of the realm of what you should care about because you're interested in economics or business, that's really no longer the case. And so, and the good news is that I think a lot of those students know that. And I've heard a shift in a lot of students going from climate change is real and happening versus I don't think it's happening to everyone kind of agrees that it's happening, and now the conversation is moving towards what kind of solutions. And you hear some folks who historically might not have been on board with believing that climate change is real and happening saying it's real, I don't want policy to drive this. I want market forces. I want market solutions. I want voluntary participation. And so it's really encouraging to sort of see that shift. We might not agree on the solutions, but at least we're talking about solutions instead of, spending more time debating whether or not the climate change is happening or not.
Yeah.
And I think, you brought up SEC, and we're actually probably different there. We very much oppose that rule. And primarily because what I kind of get back to is, as we develop policy, we do want it voluntary incentive-based. And so my experience has been, as we've dealt with, especially in the food sector, that we deal with the larger and larger companies, you have shareholders controlling the dialogue. And for a shareholder on a publicly traded company, it's got to be about profit. And so us in agriculture down on the other end of it, we want to make sure that we have shareholders that actually understand the mechanics of agriculture, and that you can't necessarily just flip a switch to somehow ensure that their stockholders are happy. And so I think we've worked really hard at having those conversations with some of our large food sector entities to help understand that we need a very holistic approach. And if we have the dollar strictly dictating how we do climate change, I'm not sure that's healthy for the country.
Any others want to share a perspective?
Oh, very anecdotally compared to these academic responses, I speak to a lot of 3rd and 4th grade classrooms. And I always ask, so what do you want to see more of in your community? And at the beginning, I expected to hear, well, we need a justice at the mall or something like that, or, hoo-ha. Actually, I heard hoo-ha a lot. If the hoo-ha's listening, Norfolk's a market for you. But always at the top of the list are things like more parks, more walkable neighborhoods, cleaner air and water. That's always top 5 answers. So there's this intuitive sense among young people, very young people even, that we need to do better, and this is the kind of world I want to live in. So, and I think the other answer to part of that is technology, embracing the technology opportunities that come with being solutions to this. Precision ag technology. We have a new business coming to Norfolk that it manufactures pivot monitors and pump monitors and moisture sensors and things like that. There's a huge opportunity in regions like ours for that kind of thing, and that attracts younger people. Those technology jobs rooted in sustainable systems attract younger people, and there are opportunities for our smaller communities to, again, engage in the new economy.
Yeah, so this question on the screen here is kind of related to what we've talked about with voluntary programs and incentive-based programs. So if mitigative actions are incentive-based, what might the funding structure or source look like? Which is a complicated question. Anybody want to take that?
Well, I work again with a lot of food and beverage supply chain companies, and somewhat related to the Security and Exchange Commission, sort of climate-related disclosures, or at least some sort of accounting of your greenhouse gas footprint for these companies is pretty much part and parcel of what most of the large food and beverage companies do. They're not going to have precise estimates, but they're going to be able to tell you their greenhouse gas footprint associated with their direct emissions from facilities, indirect from purchase, energy, and then also sort of the more indirect, sort of hard to calculate things, something like, tilling your farm, releases greenhouse gases, and then that farm sources to these companies. And so they're also kind of trying to track down those indirect emissions as well in their supply chains. And for those sort of different types of emissions, most companies have set very ambitious goals, and some of them are at 2030, some of them are at 2050. You'll hear targets thrown around like, we're going to be net zero across all of our operations by 2050. And we are trying to help the companies meet those goals because they're incredibly ambitious, and oftentimes those goals are set before there's necessarily a plan in place. And part of getting from where they are to where they want to go is absolutely going to be incentivizing the practices that we care about. And in the food and beverage sector, that is going to be incentivizing farmers to adjust their practices. A lot of the details still need to be worked out, but I think it's really important for the consumers to pay attention to those targets and hold companies' feet to the fire. Make sure that if those targets are being blown past, that there are some sort of repercussions and that people are paying attention. I think that's one way we can start sort of shifting the system towards incentivizing those practices rather than sort of forcing or compelling those practices to take place.
So we do have a couple of minutes left. So 90 minutes goes fast when you're sitting around among friends here. So I did want to just ask one last question of each of you. You can kind of give us your elevator speech, kind of last shot at the audience here. What is something that you want the audience to take away from this conversation? It could be from your perspective, or maybe something that you heard somebody say that keyed into your mind. But what's a takeaway you want folks to leave with?
I can kick it off. I think the first thing that comes to my mind is that the impacts of climate change are now. They're here in Nebraska, and those impacts are having impacts on our society and our health. And so, one, we need to make sure that we're doing things to reduce greenhouse gas emission so that we can flatten that further curve into the future, flatten the curve. We've heard about that quite a bit the last couple of years. And then the other part of it is we need to take action to reduce the impacts of climate change on our health now. And we need to do things through adaptation, which is basically we need to make sure that we're addressing the health impacts that we're facing now. We need to make sure that we're building more resilient communities. We need to improve our healthcare systems. We need to make sure that we're attacking this from multiple different angles. Because if we're able to do that, we can reduce the health impacts and the impacts that that this is having on us. And if we're not doing that now, if we wait 10, 20, 30 years, whatever, those impacts are going to be a lot more apparent, and it's going to be a lot harder to right the ship at that point.
Yeah.
I think a takeaway from me is, again, I'm going to repeat it, that being part of the climate solution is also an opportunity for us, economically, socially, culturally. And we have all the tools, we have all the ingredients here in Nebraska to play a role front and center. We just need to embrace the opportunities as such. And that's everything from clean energy. I talked about a new business that's coming. One of our bedrock industries is Nucor Steel, which is North America's largest recycler of metal to make into steel. Building on those type of things, those niches that are part of mitigation, are part of the solution, and embracing the opportunities that spin off from those, I think, is important. And also getting in the game policy-wise, like helping drive conversations that will bring state officials, local officials into the same room, around the same table, talking about how are we best prepared for what we are seeing now, more frequent events, and how do we build for the future, and how can that not only help protect us, but help position our communities for growth.
Yeah, and I would second and third all of that and just say that we do have the solutions. We do know, for the most part, what needs to be done, and ultimately, those actions are human endeavors. One thing I've learned through my time at the Nature Conservancy is that a lot of collective action comes down to two people having an interaction. And so for me, learning how to set ego aside, truly listen, and build capacity in our relationships is a really wonderful and easy way that we can all build more adaptive capacity to climate change. Because as Jesse says, it's real, it's happening, it's here. And if we have those individual sort of resilient relationships, it's going to make us all weather the uncertainty much better.
Yeah, for me, probably I learned several things from this group, and certainly relative to just societally, taking care of other things outside of the thing that I think about food. We talk very little about food security, and in agriculture, fundamentally, that's what we produce. And I'm just really excited that even on a university, we grow a lot of corn in Nebraska, And the fact that we have researchers that are breeding corn plants to tolerate colder climates and warmer climates on both sides of the spectrum when we think about climate change. But the takeaway that I want the audience to understand is that agriculture is highly engaged, and we are for humanity because what we do is produce food for humanity. And one of the things that climate change certainly threatens is our food supply. And that is what we wake up every day thinking about, doing, producing. And at the end of the day, it's critical we take that responsibility humbly on. And we're committed to ensuring that both in Nebraska and globally, that we're a player in food sustainability for both our state, country, and world.
Yeah. So Mark, that was a great segue. You mentioned humanity, and so I wanted to introduce the Director of Humanities, Nebraska. We're at, I think we're a little bit past time, but if you want to close us out here.
Please help me thank this wonderful panel and Martha, Josh, Jesse, Hannah, Mark. We just so appreciate your time in this great discussion. We have about 50 questions we didn't get to tonight. There were so many questions. Thank you to everybody who submitted those. We'll share them with the panel and figure out how to get answers out. I think we might have to do this again sometime. So we just really appreciated everybody's interest in the topic. We also put out a polling question about what it was your most impactful moment from tonight's discussion, so feel free to answer that one, and that will be really interesting for us to look at. I really hope you take a moment also if you go to our website after this, or there's a QR code, and share your thoughts, even when you go home tonight or whatever, share your thoughts about tonight's program and what suggestions you might have for the future. I really want to thank the team that planned this program. Martha, it's not easy to moderate something like this, and I know you've done a lot of panels, and asking you to moderate was a big ask, so we really appreciate you. I really encourage any of you who are interested in weather, and who isn't in this state, to follow Martha's website, the Nebraska State Climatologist. It's the Nebraska State Climate Office, nsco.unl.edu. I also want to thank Professors Joe Starita and Jennifer Shepard from UNL, who this program was inspired by a year-long class that they had of journalism students studying climate change in Nebraska from 2020 to 2021, and it was really inspiring. And you can visit their Climate Change in Nebraska website and see all the stories that these amazing students wrote about this topic. And then, excuse me, I also want to thank Humanities Nebraska's program manager, Christy Hyatt-Carley, Sherilyn Hansen, and all the other staff at Humanities Nebraska for all the work. We couldn't have done it without them. And the Lead Center, thank you for hosting us tonight. This program is part of a national initiative called Democracy and the Informed Citizen, and that's funded by the Mellon Foundation and administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils. And we also appreciate Rhonda Seacrest's local supporters' help, and I think Rhonda's with us tonight. And then, Humanities Nebraska is a statewide nonprofit, and we're working every day to help people explore what connects us and makes us human, and we saw a great example of that tonight. So I encourage you to visit our website and learn more about our programs. I'd really love to do more on weathering uncertainty this fall. If you can make it to McHargue in the end of July, we're going to have a great Chautauqua about the 1950s called the 50s in Focus. And here at the Lead Center on September 28th will be our Governor's Lecture in the Humanities, and there's going to be a big announcement on that speaker in the next couple days. So I hope you can make it. You will be thrilled with it if you won't want to miss it. And then just finally, just thank all of you for being here tonight. We just can't do this without all of you, an audience, and I hope you just drive safe and have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.